Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So a few days ago I did a fairly large video which quite a few of you have watched. Thanks for watching that. I'll put the link below in case you haven't seen it already, and this is really a follow-up to that. And quite a few of you, so the basic question was, where did medieval soldiers get their swords from? And that is a very big and complicated question, but I hope that I answered it at least from one perspective. And the basic answer in a sentence is that most medieval soldiers bought their swords. Okay, they bought them. There were some soldiers who were issued swords, so militias and stuff like this, personal retinues in some cases, although they generally, to be recruited, would have had their own equipment anyway. So let's draw a line under that and say most medieval soldiers bought their swords. Now, the secondary question that quite a lot of you, I think, got irate about the fact that I hadn't answered was, where did they buy their swords from? Well, quite simply, a shop. Okay, this, and I know I always say this, but this isn't going to be a big video. The basic fact is that late medieval Europe, so when we're talking about medieval period, obviously that covers a wide period of time. If we just talk about the late medieval period, which is I think what most of you are interested in and asking this question about, was the infrastructure of late medieval Europe, or even middle of the medieval period Europe, was very developed. You know, there were cities and there were towns, there were travelling merchants, there were shops and there were markets and this kind of stuff. And the fact is that you could buy a sword from lots of different places. But what sort of places would you buy a sword from? Well, quite simply, there were cutlers, there were sword makers. If you lived in a really rural environment, could you get a sword from a blacksmith? Well, probably technically you could, but really trades were quite specialised in this period. So for the large part, sword makers were sword makers. That's what they did. They made swords. In some cases, there were knife makers who also made swords, and that's when we get into this question about the so-called Langmesser, or where does that sit in sword makers guilds and stuff like this. And that's the other thing to mention, of course, that all of these specialist trades, whether you were a jeweler or an armourer or a sword maker, they had their own guilds in many countries. So first of all, there were people who made swords and sold them directly themselves. Secondly, there were people who made swords and then sold them to retailers. So, travelling merchants, or in some cases, a shopkeeper who might stock the weapons and the armour and the equipment from many different makers. So really, in many ways, quite similar to the modern world. If we look at modern sword makers, some of them, if you take someone like Peter Johnson, he makes swords to order and sells them himself. But then if you take something like Cult of Athena, they buy in swords from various makers and they are a reseller. It was exactly the same in the medieval world. The other thing to mention as well is that not all people necessarily bought swords from, brand new and bought them from a shop or from a maker. There was a large trade in second-hand swords. And of course, a sword doesn't have to be bought new. If you compare it with something like a car or even a horse or a piano, if you want to buy any of those things in the modern world, you've got a basic choice. You either buy a new one or you buy a second-hand one. And it was exactly the same in the medieval world. A sword like this might be owned in its sort of usable service life. It might be owned by 3 different people. They might die, they might cease being a soldier and not want a sword anymore. They might get old and sell on their sword or leave it in their will, and that's another thing I'll mention in a second. So absolutely, there were many different ways you could buy swords, both new and second-hand. And the other thing to mention as well is there's a fair amount of evidence that people who sold new swords also sold second-hand swords. So very much like buying a car in many ways, because obviously a sword seller was a sword seller, and if a sword came to you and it was like, well, yeah, this sword's 10 years old, but it's in pretty good condition, we'll clean it up, we'll put it on the wall, we'll sell it as a used sword. It might be slightly out of fashion, might be slightly old-fashioned, but someone will still buy it. And if you can buy a sword for 8 pence instead of a shilling or whatever, by buying a second-hand one, then you're going to do that. Now, I mentioned wills. This is a very important source of information when we're looking at the medieval period, because we can see what was left by people who were dead, essentially. People, their estates, what they left to their people who were inheriting from them, their sons and daughters usually. And often those things are valued, and from that we can tell the value of swords. Now, very often, in fact, well, pretty much always, of course, by their very nature, the swords that are being described in those wills are second-hand swords, because they're not brand new, it's not a retailer. And we can see a variety of values, and people talk about the value. People often ask me what the value of a sword was in the 14th or 15th century, and the basic answer is it's how long is a piece of string. It's how much does ask me how much does a car cost in the year 2018. You can spend £50 on a car, or you can spend 5 million on a car. You know, there's no, and it was exactly the same with swords in the medieval period. I've done specific videos about this in the past. But if we look at wills and inventories, we can see swords valued as little as two pence. Now, bear in mind that an average worker in medieval England at this time was paid around 2-3 pence a day, and a trained archer, essentially a professional archer, recruited archer, would be on 6 pence a day. So you could get a sword, and they are usually described as old or rusty swords, for very, very little. So swords, any sword, could be bought for very little money. But if you were buying a decent quality sword, something akin to an Albion, you know, a basic but good quality sword, in the medieval period, then of course it would be more expensive. But how much more will you bought a sword that suited your means, suited your pocket, and as much as you could afford? Final couple of things to mention. A lot of people mentioned looting on the battlefield. Well, two problems with that. As I responded in the comments under the previous video, first of all, common soldiers weren't allowed to loot, or rather weren't allowed to keep the loot. All loot had to be given to the commanders, at least in England and France and other countries that I've looked at. So the basic rule was all loot went to the guy in charge. They then usually sold the stuff, and then the money was shared out amongst the commanders, who then shared it out amongst their men. So generally speaking, no, you couldn't take a sword off a fallen knight and go, oh, this is a nice sword, I'll have this. That's fantasy. That's Conan, Lord of the Rings type thing. It's not medieval history, okay? In medieval Europe, generally speaking, that would be theft, okay? You were there to do a job, you were paid to do the job per day, and you got a share of the loot once it had been divided up and calculated, and all of the commanders and people in charge had taken their great big cut out of it. You sometimes got a share of that in money, in actual money. No, you couldn't go around looting swords. That was theft, just as it is in the modern world. The final thing to mention is in the earlier medieval period, there weren't obviously such developed towns and cities with as much infrastructure in terms of trading. There weren't guilds and stuff like this until later. So how did people buy swords in, let's say, around the time of the Norman conquest, 11th century, or even earlier in the Frankish period, 8th, 9th century? How did they buy swords? Probably from armour and sword making centres, of which there weren't many. So the Rhineland had quite a few, it was quite famous for making swords. Certain parts of Spain was already quite famous for making swords, and other areas. And probably there were travelling merchants selling these things. I mean, this is partly guesswork. We don't really know. Perhaps in some cases they actually travelled or sent one of their envoys to that place to buy a sword from that place. But probably most swords that were bought in the earlier medieval period were done so through a sort of network of traders who conveyed goods, much like the Silk Road, conveyed goods across quite large distances, and probably in many cases travelled all around Europe, buying and selling things as they went. So the route by which a sword could get from the Rhineland in Germany to what's now Scotland could be very complex and might take years actually to get from one place to another through a series of traders. Anyway, I hope that kind of answers the question a bit more fully than I did previously. If you haven't watched the previous video, then do. If you're not subscribed, please do. Give us a like, turn that notification bell on, and I will see you for the next video really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.